and start with the guidelines. The webinar is beginning now, here that we are at 1 o'clock. All those who are attending will be muted until we open the Q&A. That button can be found at the bottom of your screen so that when that time comes, you can make comments and ask questions, and the chat will be available for the entire conversation. So this is Engineering Solutions for the Next Pandemic, Exploring Ethics Concerns. It is a series of 3 panels. Today we are doing the second of those 3 panels. This is a project of the Online Ethics, what we're calling the Ethics Center for Engineering Society, otherwise known as the OEC. It's also particularly this go round for this series in partnership with the Engineering Ethics Division of the American Association of Engineering Education and the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, referred to as APE. And as always, we want to thank our generous contributors, sponsors, the NSF, who are the primary funders of this OEC project. So I am going to stop share at this point. There we go. So the demands of the Civil War, which broke out in 1861, were conducive to the formation of a scientific consulting body to advise our nation. To meet the government's urgent need for an independent advisor on scientific matters, President Lincoln signed a congressional charter forming the National Academy of Sciences in 1863. Under the same charter, the Academy eventually expanded to include the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine. The OEC panel series explores the role of today's scientists and engineers in helping our nation to address its current urgencies, such as the coronavirus. Humanity has encountered pandemics in the recent past, and yet we were not prepared for the magnitude of COVID-19 infections. In the midst of this crisis, solutions are being sought with a sense of urgency. For example, human challenge testing will accelerate the vaccination development process. Short of a vaccine, the controlled avalanche approach has been proposed in order to gain herd immunity. Given the need to find solutions quickly, ought research and development ethics be compromised? To discuss these and other questions, we are joined today by David Allison, who's a member of the NAM, Dean and Provost Professor, Indiana University School of Public Health, Bloomington. Welcome, thank you. And Stephanie Bird, Founding Editor, Science and Engineering Ethics. Thanks for being with us, Stephanie. I don't think that we have Arthur Kaplan at this point, so we will move on and welcome Ezekiel Garfinkel, Global Head of Ethics, Risk and Compliance for Novartis Research and Development. Hi, welcome from Israel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Peter Schwartz, Director, Indiana University Center for Bioethics and Associate Professor of Medicine, Indiana University School of Medicine. My heartfelt thanks to each of you for your time and efforts to engage this important subject with us today. And welcome to all of those who are here as attenders. We will begin with an opening statement from each of our panelists, followed by conversation among them. And then for the last half an hour, we will invite attendees to make comments, ask questions of our panelists. Until that time, however, all will remain on mute. So let's begin with Peter.
Hey, hello everybody. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. I was initially going to go second after Art, and so I will go first now. So I'm sure Art will come and join us when he can. So I'm going to make 3 comments in my little 5-minute introductory remarks related to 3 of the questions that the conveners have asked. First of all, about challenge trials, I want to say right off the bat that I'm in favor of them. I think that bioethics arguments have been made very strongly and correctly, showing that this would be an acceptable way to do testing on a COVID vaccine under certain circumstances that may very well be at play in the next few months as we move into that phase, hopefully, in the development of a vaccine. I was going to say, and I'll say anyway, that actually being on a panel with Art Kaplan, who also supports this view and has published on it, makes me feel safe saying that. Because I know if there's some question that we get that I can't answer, Art will have an answer for any question or challenge, because I always feel good about that. If you want to be on the same side with Art in general, rather than arguing against him, if you want things to go well. And I think Art is often right on the money on bioethics issues, and I'm happy to be on the same side with him. I think we'll have a lot to say about that during this session. When I think about a challenge trial, I compare the risks and burdens for people who would participate in that against those who would be in another kind of more traditional phase 3 trial, who would be randomized either to intervention or especially to the control arm. And I agree with Nirial and others that it's not clear that the risks to the patients in a challenge trial are significantly higher than those who would be in a phase 3 trial, especially those who'd be randomized to the control arm without the vaccine. We philosophers and ethicists worry a lot about who causes the harm to a participant. But I think in this case, and again, I think we'll have a chance to talk about it at greater length during the discussion, what I care about is who gets hurt and how many live and die. And the fine points of where that harm came from are relevant in some situations and less relevant in others. And it takes the care and careful thought of bioethics, I believe, to parse that out and show that this is actually a good way to go. So that leads to my second point, which is to talk about bioethics as a field. This is a case of bioethics contributing, I think, in a very positive way to a very important and specific way in which research may be conducted. And this is, speaks very highly and well towards the value of bioethics. Of course, people make claims for bioethics often. They talk about the value as a field, similar to other fields of humanities, for instance, as an area for reflection, an area perhaps for education of people to reflect on their role and the meaning of their actions in a way that makes them better people, better citizens. In the case of bioethics, better healthcare providers, hopefully. But bioethics is special and unlike other humanities in its direct and founding principle of contribution to action and of guideline and recommendation to specific questions that are facing, in this case, healthcare professionals, about what to do. From the very beginning, of course, think of ventilators and Karen Quinlan, and think of, in the area of research ethics, things about how to design human subjects research. Bioethics from its beginning was about finding answers, even though its basis has been in fields of humanities and social sciences, such as philosophy, my background. This is also not the first time that a consensus, well, a strong position in bioethics would contribute to the way that research is being conducted. My example here is something I've lived through in my career, which is the transition of thought about biobanks in general, right? And so with biobanks, we began maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, with great reservations expressed by people in society and researchers about having an open-ended collection of samples and biological information, perhaps medical information, for open-ended research for the foreseeable future, perhaps the unending future. And there was great concern about how to do this ethically and whether it could be done ethically. And the bioethicists in the field of bioethics, I think, did a great job of thinking these issues through carefully, contributing to discussion of regulation and construction of the systems for allowing this kind of research to go forward. And in many ways, shepherded this research into being, where now we live in a world of biobanks and the kind of research that's allowing. So once again, it's an example of bioethics as making a contribution to the advance and the progress of science and to the improvement of medicine in a very active way. We do reflection, but often with the goal of actually allowing ethical and effective action. Finally, on my last point, I see that Art has joined us. Art, I promised them you would be here. I knew you would. I did get to tell embarrassing stories about you in the interim, just so. Anyway, so my final point is about the STEM education question, which Roz asked about, and the organizer of the panel asked, but is there a lesson for us about STEM education that comes out of this pandemic? And I will say absolutely yes. And the two lessons I want to point to are, first, I want to paraphrase a teacher of mine from college who used to say, you may not be interested in business, for those of us who are not interested in the world of business and economics. You may not be interested in business, but business is interested in you, right? Whether you care or not, the structure of the world of business will affect your life. And so you should think about it. And here, of course, to paraphrase, I'd say you may not be interested in disease and public health, but disease and public health is interested in you. And so as we are all living now, tragically and concerningly, through a time of pandemic, we are reminded that disease is part of life and public health is an essential cornerstone of life in society. Just as we feel safe in our health, we feel often safe in our world of public health, and we need to be aware of the dangers and be educated, and STEM contributes to that. Second, and a little more precisely, the pandemic and people's response to it reminds us of the importance of numeracy and in particular understanding of notions of probability in life. We often need these sort of skills as we think about what's happening in society. We think about the spread of this pandemic and the measures being taken to combat it, what their purpose is, what success looks like, and what failure looks like. Without notions of numeracy, i.e. comfort with numbers, without some understanding of probability, it's hard to understand these things. But even more importantly, it's actually hard to plan your own actions in response to risk if you don't understand basic ideas of things like prevalence versus infection rate, or sensitivity and specificity of tests. That would be false positives and false negatives. These are hard concepts. This is part of education to help people understand these things, but we are aware now of the dangers of misunderstanding and perhaps the importance, again, of STEM education to provide at least a gist. People don't have to be scientists. Not everybody's going to be a scientist, but people have to have some comfort with these notions and ability to interact with them if they are to make choices based on them. So I'll finish there with a ringing endorsement of the importance of STEM and how the pandemic has emphasized that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. And I'm going to take a moment here to say thank you very much and welcome to Art Kaplan. And Art Kaplan is the William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor, founding head, Division of Medical Ethics, NYU School of Medicine. So glad that you're here. We were just a little nervous because apparently you're also on a radio show out of Boston right now. At any rate, the intention was to have Peter speak after you, but he got the first word, but I think he agrees with you. But why don't we take a moment and have David speak just a little bit, I'm sorry, have Izzy speak a little bit out of order, and then bring it back around to get another ethics perspective. Is that comfortable? Okay.
Fine by me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going back on the radio.
Okay.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And hi from somewhere next to Tel Aviv, Israel, 8 p.m. So I'm Ezzy Garfinkel, and I'm leading the ethics and compliance function in Novartis, mainly the research and development. And I'm not bioethicist at all. And I hope that it's okay. I will talk a bit, and I'm sure that the honorable panel members will talk a lot about the ethical implications of control human infection trials. But I wanted to talk a bit about at least our pharmaceutical point of view. So not a lot of time, 2 or 3 minutes, but maybe to raise, I mean, obviously challenge studies require a lot of resources and special preparation. I'm not sure that all companies know how to do it, and their companies not doing it every day. Now, how pharmaceutical companies with their current pipeline of products and yes, limited resources, very limited resources, should prioritize their own projects during pandemics and maybe to do challenge studies, it's a question. And when I was thinking about this panel, I thought about constantly about, should we during pandemics continue to work on spinal muscular atrophy studies or other life-saving products, or we should allocate immediate resources to fight pandemics because this is what society's immediate expectation. I can tell you that as a corporate person, suddenly after 10 years, people are asking me, hey, what are you doing to fight this pandemic? I mean, until recently, I was almost the bad guys, I would say. So it is hardly, or it is extremely hard to internally prioritize our studies during pandemics overall. Obviously, there's patient safety and program integrity and health authorities request from us, from all pharmaceuticals company, country and local challenges, other critical topics. So adding complexity to do a not regular study might be very challenging. The second point that I wanted to raise, and hopefully the honorable panel members will be able to talk about later on after the regular ethical discussion, is such decision on resource allocation and prioritization should take into account obviously the regular ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, justice, fairness, transparency. But we, as the executor of such studies, have usually some additional things to consider. And I hope I'm not being too much controversy here, but we have shareholders, we have sales target, we have competitors that maybe will not go with such studies and will continue executing their pipeline. Will it affect our internal decision-making going towards such studies? I have more topics that are more related to the tangible level of executing those studies, more related to compliance, but I will leave it here, and I hope it just gives some kind of food for thought later on.
Absolutely, and thank you, Ezzy. And in fact, when we were as a committee working on identifying panelists, someone said, we have got to get some kind of perspective from beyond the academy, from a corporate setting, so that we have a fuller understanding of what's at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, then. Artie, would you like to offer a few opening comments then?
Sure. And it's really great to be on this panel with Peter, who's a former student of mine, which is always dangerous, and Stephanie, who I've known for a long time and had a chance to learn a lot from. And actually, I get a chance to do some things with Novartis here and there. So that's fun. And to see David is a great honor as well. So thanks, everybody, for coming. And thanks, Ross, for putting it together. I have 3 areas to comment on. I want to follow up something Peter said about being numerate. I think it's also very important as we do this kind of webinar that we realize the importance of communication skills, that we try to build in the ability to talk to the public about these matters into the training of our postdocs and students, medical science. You know, we were joking, I was on the radio talking about this. I spent some time in the media and on social media trying to explain different ethical policy aspects as best I understand them about the COVID pandemic. But there are a heck of a lot more people out there who don't know anything about it. I'm very convinced who are talking up quite a storm. So I don't think we've done what we should in the engineering, science, medical communities to make communication skills part of training, to get people to feel that they should engage the public. And I'm not just talking about, you know, putting your favorite op-ed in the New York Times. I mean, at the church, at the Kiwanis Club, at the high school, there are many, many forums. You know, as someone who studied for a long time vaccines, I know about vaccine hesitancy, I know about vaccine fears. You have to engage those on the ground. It's great sometimes to talk to your friends as a guest on national public radio, but that's probably not where the vaccine resistors are. They're going to be showing up at public meetings and gatherings and other places. So in addition to trying to emphasize numeracy, understanding risk, being able to communicate about it, being able to have the communication skills, very, very important. And it's something I hope maybe comes out of our attention to STEM and the ethics of STEM as part of this kind of activity, which is a great way to reinforce and perk that along. I want to explore 2 substantive areas very briefly, and we can come back to them if people are interested. One is the issue that's come up about how the government is spending its research money, which I find very interesting, having had a little bit of insider exposure to NIH thinking and BARDA, the HHS arm that has been involved with, well, it's been in the news controversially recently with some firings and so on. But basically, the federal government research effort is really oriented strongly toward vaccines. It's very political. The president has almost promised that we're going to vaccinate our way out of this pandemic, and that will be a rationale for allowing us to open up society, maybe get away from some of the behavioral precautions and risk dampening activities and behaviors that we should engage in, because the vaccine will be here. I heard the president say in the fall. I actually heard Tony Fauci say the vaccine will be here by December, like Merry Christmas gift. And many other people are talking about vaccines arriving, in early next year. I'm going to say something about that in a minute, and to tip my hand, I doubt it. But what I am bothered about is that there are many people, for various reasons, who are not going to respond to vaccines. A good vaccine, a great vaccine, measles, probably has a 92% efficacy rate. There's still people who don't respond to it. A lot of vaccines, mumps, hover around 82, 83% responsiveness. And flu, unfortunately, due to problems with different strains, some years you're at 30%. And my point is, even if you got a vaccine, and even if by some miracle it showed up by Christmas, and even if it was highly effective in generating antibodies, there are likely to be many people who won't respond. And there are other people who won't respond because they're immune compromised. Maybe the elderly won't respond very well. Maybe people who are newborns won't, well, I'm sure they won't very well. And then there are people with diseases and medical problems that suppress their immune system. So it is really important not to put all our chips, I believe, on vaccines. We've got to continue to do research on drugs that might prevent infection or drugs that might treat somebody who is sick. This obsession with vaccination, I don't think is fair to those who may not respond well to vaccines. It also makes a bet on finding a vaccine, which I'm a vaccine proponent, don't get me wrong, I'm big on vaccines, but it's a gamble. We've been looking for an AIDS vaccine for 25 years and we don't have one. Been looking for a hepatitis C vaccine for a long time, don't have one. And there are many other diseases where we just haven't found a vaccine. And as I know many of you listening and my fellow panelists know, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a big antibody response to a vaccine. What if it only lasts 3 months, 6 months? You got to revaccinate. It's going to be one heck of a challenge to roll out revaccination, boosters, and so on. So I think justice demands that we think harder about where we're spending our money. I think we should spend more money on learning how to get people to behave in ways that reduce their risk. We don't spend much there. We should spend money on drugs. I think we're tipping away from that, and that's a bit of a problem. And then we have a situation where there are just going to be people who don't respond to vaccines, or we may get a vaccine that isn't that durable, and revaccination will limit its impact. So that's one thing to think about. The other is, why am I skeptical, and I'll get through this fast, that we'll have something by the fall or by early spring. Look, even if you're doing your research now and you're not going to shortcut the data, which would be a disaster in terms of stimulating vaccine resistance on the part of people who are doubters or skeptics, to say, oh, we went warp speed, but don't worry, we had to cut a few corners, but this thing is good, take it. I mean, there's already polls out there that show 30% of Americans are like, I don't know about this vaccine. If you keep talking about warp speed and accelerated and race, if you don't say warp speed to a safe vaccine, race to a safe vaccine, you're going to scare a lot of folks away from taking it. And more to the point, large-scale trials, unless we're going to do something like a challenge study model, which we can talk about later, but a large-scale trial recruiting 20, 30,000 subjects, all I'm going to say is it's slow to recruit. It's hard to get diversity. You don't necessarily get all the people you want to see in terms of older people, for example, signing on. And you are exposing them to risk, right? It's an untested vaccine. It's not like there's no risk in getting exposed to that. So it may be slow. Plus, ironically, ethically, as you recruit people to be in a COVID vaccine study, you have to tell them to do things to minimize their likelihood of getting infected, right? The moral thing to do is not to say, hey, we gave you this experimental vaccine, go out there, take your mask off, run around like a nut, go to bars, get a tattoo while you're at it. You know, you want to, you got to tell them to be safe. It's hindered AIDS vaccine research because we keep saying, you know, we have this experimental AIDS vaccine, but you got to try and be safe and don't engage in risky behavior. Same thing's true here. So my point is 30,000 people recruited, slow, then finding out whether nature will infect them at a rate that allows us to know what the heck is going on. That depends on the virus's moods, right? It breaks out in some places, goes away in other places. You can try and chase around infection hotspots, but hopefully we tamp them down. So I suspect, just based on recruitment of subjects, the likelihood of getting something right out of the box as a first vaccine that works, which would make me, I'll pay $1 to all the panelists if that happens, and collecting convincing data if we rely on the attack rate, as they say, of the virus just out in nature. That isn't Christmas. I mean, it's just not, and to talk that way, I think, is dangerous because it undermines people's willingness to go along with behavior change, which is probably our best, limited, but best weapon that we've got. So those are some areas to think about, and I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David, I wonder in your remarks if you could help our listeners to understand a little bit about what challenge testing is, as opposed to the generalized conventional development of vaccines, if you don't mind.
Sure,
don't might not understand. Thank you.
Don't mind at all. First, I'm glad to be here, honored to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, honored to be on with the other panels. As I was studying up for this, I kept reading Art Kaplan's work and watching his videos. So it's great to be here with everybody. A challenge study, really, it's very simple. The idea is you want to speed the time to an answer. You want to decrease the time to an answer by essentially getting more shots on goal, as they say. So instead of waiting for people to be exposed and then seeing, is there a statistically significant difference between those who are vaccinated and those who got placebo, which could take a very long time if the exposures are slow, you intentionally expose people. So, you know, there are studies, as Dr. Kaplan mentioned, this already is done. It's done with flu sometimes, and, you know, you drip some influenza virus into people's respiratory tract, and you see what happens after infecting half and, after vaccinating half with real vaccine and half with placebo. So that would be a challenge study. Very simple concept. The practice is, of course, not very simple. And one of the things that I think that the two or three speakers who've gone before me have highlighted, which I think is very important, and sort of you asked for a takeaway message in STEM, is the distinction between data and values, and that both of those are necessary for intelligent and rational decision-making, but often, including by professionals, I think, in science and public health and academia, we lose that distinction sometimes. We think that because we have a certain bit of data, that gives us, that tells us what we should do. But in fact, it only tells us what we should do at best if we can combine that with our values and then make a judgment as to what best achieves our values or what is best in accord with our values. And I think Dr. Kaplan's remarks in particular of all the, you could go here, but then this happens, but what about this, and so on, sort of elucidates that. So I think that's an important thing to talk about. And it points out the need for both the empirical side and the sort of theoretical conceptual side. On the empirical side, the argument in favor of challenge trials is very practical. It's, we're going to get a vaccine faster if we have the challenge trial. And that, of course, rests on many empirical assumptions. Those assumptions may be valid, but they may not. And that brings into, you know, we have to bring into those questions. We also have to bring into questions, as Dr. Kaplan pointed out, about how valuable is a vaccine. If we think, and here we go to informed consent, if I'm a potential subject thinking about, do I really have informed consent to enroll in a challenge trial and put myself at risk? What am I putting myself at risk for? And if you tell me I'm putting myself at risk for a vaccine that's likely to be nearly 100% effective in nearly 100% of the people, that's one thing. And if you say to me, it's likely to be 30% effective and it's likely to require a new booster shot every year like the flu vaccine, well, that's a different thing. I still might be willing to do it, but those things matter. And so we've got to get the evidence for that. A group that I'm working with, inter-university, group team is trying to actually, we're fundraising for a big study right now that would look at exactly that to say, what do we know about immunity, about the durability of immunity? If you get SARS-CoV-2 infection and recover, to what extent are you immune? For how long are you immune? Do antibodies confer immunity? Do they denote immunity even if they don't confer it? Which antibodies, and so on. All of these are critical questions, and we need to know the answers to these, both for our society in general and for designing these trials and understanding their ethics. So that's something we hope to be able to contribute to, and we've got to get that empirical knowledge. It's interesting, as I mentioned, that the idea is challenge studies will be ethically justified, or might be ethically justified, if in fact they really bring us better studies faster and less expensively. The question is that realistic? And you know, one of the things, as I said, I'm new to this game, and I had to learn recently. I said, well, you've got to know what strain to administer. You can't just, you know, you don't just go to CVS and say, can I please have a container of SARS-CoV-2? You've got to know which strain. You've got to know the dose to administer it in. So you've got to do some research on that beforehand, and that research is going to take some time. Now, once assuming you decide to move forward, you can't just infect people with a highly infectious, very serious virus and then say, please go back on the subway now and head home and we'll see you in a few weeks. You're going to probably want to keep those people contained. So you've got to have a place to contain them. And that may take some time to generate. And that place has got to be big enough for the numbers of subjects you need. And we're talking about 150-ish vaccines that people are talking about investigating. And if you did all of those vaccines and all the subjects you need, that's a lot of places. Would we have those places in time? That also brings up issues of containment. You've got to contain the virus. You don't want it leaking out. So you need a BSL-3 lab to be running this thing. You're going to have some special ethics panels. That's going to slow things down. So when you build all of that in, will this really be faster than running a conventional trial? And again, I don't know the answer to that. But those are the questions we have to ask. We should not assume a priori that it will be faster because of all those things. I think there are also some value questions that go beyond the empirical and the math. The article referenced by Nir Eyal earlier, which I think is a very compelling and interesting article, talks about the mathematics of the risk. Are we really exposing subjects to so much greater risk, if any greater risk, in a challenge trial than not? And I think that's open to question. But in fact, we know that our tolerability for risk depends in part upon the cause of the risk. And I think Peter hinted at that earlier in his remarks. And so if you say to me, I have a 5% chance of being struck by lightning and killed in some circumstance, or a 5% chance of being shot by a ruthless gunman in some circumstance, it's still 5%, but I can tolerate being struck by lightning to a greater extent because somehow that seems less outrageous and less appalling. And I think we need to think about that as well. What about the ethical protection of the people doing the study, not only from their protection of risk, but what about their feelings of guilt of having infected somebody? It's probably very important that the ethics of trials take that into account to make that tolerable if it was to move forward. Just as in, to take a very extreme metaphor, just as in executions, in a firing squad, no one person fires the gun. Many people fire the gun, so it's not so clear whose shot was the shot that killed the person, and alleviates guilt. Whether you think that's a good thing or not is open to question. But we know that these are issues, and so that may be something that needs to be taken into account. One of the things one frequently hears as part of the arguments against the challenge trial is that we don't have a rescue drug for this. It's not as though we can go in and say, oh, okay, you got infected and now you're sick, take this pill and you'll be okay. We don't have that pill. Now, we do have some treatments, though, that have some benefit. Dexamethasone seems to have some benefit as an example. And so the question would be, how good does that rescue drug need to be? It's not zero or none. It's not that we have no treatment for people, but it's not that we have extremely effective treatments. Where in the middle is enough? And again, informed consent will be important there, and really issuing that information. Another big question is, can you leave once you're infected? So if I volunteer to be in the challenge trial, in most studies, there's always this thing which says, part of the informed consent, I may withdraw at any time, no penalty. May I withdraw if I'm infected now with a highly infectious agent and I say, look, thanks, I don't like being in the study anymore. I'm going to get back on the subway and run around, or now am I Typhoid Mary? So I think these questions need to be raised. Issues of compensation. If we're going to lock people up in a facility for probably on the order of 4 weeks and expose them to a risk of infection, we might think a large compensation is in order. Many people, I happen not to be one of them, but many people raise concerns about offering large compensation in randomized trials or other research studies with the argument that it's coercive. I don't personally understand the logic of that argument, but I would flip this around. If in fact we do offer those large inducements, and I think if we were to do challenge studies, we should, then what does that say about who we allow into this? And that gets me to the last point that I really want to focus on, which is I've heard many people say that if we're going to do challenge studies, we need to do these probably mostly in young, healthy people because they're at the lowest risk. And I want to question that. I think that logic may be a little bit backward. The first thing is, what is the ethics of excluding people? So if we have an 80-year-old person who says, you know, I could really use the money here, and you're paying big money because this is something that will help me pay my rent or do whatever else I need to do, is it just to exclude that person? Or if the person wants to come for more beneficent reasons, I want to make a contribution to society. I may not have that much longer. This could be my last hurrah. I want to go out doing something meaningful. Who are we to say no? I think that's very reasonable that they, in fact, should be welcomed in. I'm struck by the old quotation that war is the process by which young men and women fight the battles of old men and women. And as someone who's starting to be closer to an old man than a young man, I might think, is it right for me to be taking people's sons and daughters into a study I would run if I'm not willing to go into it myself? And so to me, I would want the opportunity to go in if I was running such a study. I think that to me is sort of often, you know, one of the gut level, it's not a logical argument necessarily, but the gut level arbiters of, do I feel something's ethical, which is, if I would do it to somebody else, would I do this to myself? And if the answer is yes, I feel better about that. And so that, I think, speaks to that issue of who gets in and age and so on. So those are a few thoughts. I thank you for listening.
Good bit of food for thought. Thank you so much. Stephanie, you will then conclude our opening statements with yours, please.
I also appreciate the opportunity to join all of my colleagues here and see some familiar faces in different settings, etc. Good to see you, Art, for a very different setting. And I'm very intrigued by this topic, and I'm very glad that we're discussing it, especially in the context of science and technology, STEM education in general. I have a little helper here, so she's decided to edit my materials for me. I'm hoping that she won't get on my lap in addition. Anyway, I wanted especially to expand a bit on David's points about the things that go through the mind of a person who's volunteering, especially since I hear that, that dozens of thousands of people have volunteered through the internet to participate as a volunteer in a challenge study. I should say up front, I like the idea of a challenge study in terms of actually addressing the problem of moving this along more quickly. I agree with Art that December is unrealistic, but optimistic, and who doesn't want to be optimistic in difficult times? But I think that it's really important for the whole motivation ought to be altruism. I think that that's certainly something that many people are inclined to do, but I think that it needs to be part of the larger decision making. In particular, I think, along with David, that there are a lot of things that people would bring into the discussion. That's probably all of my colleagues think, in terms of what would make it feasible for me or for anyone to do it, and having a sense of what you're deciding about is challenging, especially when you're imagining having the disease versus actually having it. It's easier to imagine being able to deal with nausea and vomiting, because who hasn't, unless you're actually doing it continuously for several days, and then it takes on a different tone. So I think that being able to think clearly about what you're choosing is always a challenge. And I think the other part of it is that there's much we don't know about the long-term, the unknown unknowns, the long-term consequences, the rare consequences of this disease. It's very much been a learning experience for the research community and for the medical community over the last several months, and for the public at large. And so it certainly is a case, all of the unknown unknowns that have been put out there with respect to other diseases are, whether it's talking about shingles as the long-term consequences of getting chickenpox, or post-polio syndrome for having had polio decades before. Those are things that are very real and consequential, and that we don't really know what to factor into this discussion. And that's why I agree that on the one hand, I think that the idea of compensation for one's contribution is not an unreasonable inducement, although one person's contribution, how one's appropriately compensated for their time can really vary quite a bit. But in addition, I think we should think very seriously about healthcare, long-term healthcare for the people who make a contribution and volunteer. And I think it's not usually something that gets put in as a benefit, or even a recognition of people's contribution to research participation in general. It's usually cut off at a certain point, and yet the consequences of participating in a challenge like this may be much longer than we have any way of knowing. So I think that's something else that we should think about as a responsibility of our society to people who are willing to make this step into the unknown. So I would like that to be part of the mix as well. And I also agree that the issues about who should participate, who should be allowed to participate, really should be much broader. I agree that it's great if people who are at low risk participate, but how informative is that about people who take the vaccine ultimately that's approved for low risk people, but may actually be more risky for higher risk people for a variety of reasons. And there's already the concern about the potential for multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children that's been raised as a very rare but problematic potential consequence of having been exposed to the disease and having antibodies. And what happens with a vaccine is yet to be determined. So I think those are some things that really strike me as really important about this. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up in parallel, because it's also another major and I believe in parallel concern, technologically speaking, is the issue of testing. Everyone thinks that testing, both testing for the virus and testing for the antibody are really important to be considered in the mix for being able to identify populations that are at risk or that have the disease, and also for populations of people who are immune. That certainly carries a lot of questionable assumptions that we've touched briefly on, yet those are really important ones. And it also gets to, I think, the issue around numeracy and public understanding of these issues. On the one hand, if we're when we're thinking about testing, we need to think more extensively and in depth about who is being tested, for whom, for what purpose. So if I'm looking to get tested myself to see if I have the condition so I can decide whether or not to go visit a friend who's has a weakened immune response, I would like to know whether I'm going to carry something to her, and what do I think when I get a test result. If my doctor wants a test for me in order to determine or to confirm a diagnosis, that tells a different person something different. And if the school that my son is going to be attending wants him to be tested before they decide to have him on campus, that's another set of questions also. And besides that, and I think in concert with that, we need to think about the implications of both positives and false positives and negatives and false negatives for all of the kinds of tests that are out there. And those are things that sometimes are counterintuitive in the way that they're presented, but they raise a lot of important issues. For example, if a student comes from Nebraska in a small town, how likely are they to actually have the disease? And if they get a positive test result, how likely is that to be a false positive test result? Very likely, depending on the town, of course. So I think we really need to be thinking more carefully and thoroughly about the larger implications of some of these choices that are out there for us, and in terms of how people understand. I think the communication between the research community and the medical community and the public at large is a very challenging terrain, but it's critically important. And I think that really is fundamental to having this be a successful experience in the larger sense for all of us.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm thinking this is a really good time to invite one of our attendees to join the conversation. Jonathan Beaver, who was actually a panelist last week, has posed a question. And I wonder, Jonathan, if you'd like to take yourself off mute, think about whether there's someone in particular you'd like to ask that question of. Otherwise, please join us.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thanks to the panelists for having me. My question is rather broad, and I think you all got me thinking about it, but perhaps Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Kaplan especially. So my question I posed in the Q&A box was, in last week's panel discussion, we focused on impacts of our shifting ethical standards in the pandemic. And I was thinking, if we do speed up or shift vaccine development standards in unprecedented ways or novel ways, to what extent do you think the cat's out of the ethics bag, so to speak? Or is it rolling back to more traditional ethical standards? Is that something that becomes impossible? And secondly, is such a potential permanent shift a necessarily bad thing? Again, I was thinking about this question. The reasons we have the human subjects protections we do date way back to World War II and the sort of ethical crises we faced then. This is a different landscape and might require a different response. And so I wonder if shifting standards is something we might want to roll back, or if we even could, if we chose to. Thank you.
I'm happy to speak, or Art, or anybody.
Go ahead, Peter. You go.
Okay, yeah, so Jonathan, thank you for that question. I think it's an important issue. It sounds like you spoke about it in the last panel. I'm sorry I wasn't here for that one. So I would not see the advent of a challenge study to be rolling back or changing our ethical standards. I think the ethical standards exist in a way that continues to be in conversation with the challenges of the day. So in my example, I gave my opening remarks about biobanks. the idea was by traditional ethical standards that participants had to know about the research. That was sort of the principle. They must know the purposes and what was going to be done for what purpose. And that could not be done in a biobank. And so when we moved to biobanks, did we just give that up? Did we just let the cat out of the bag, as you said? I don't think that's a good way to describe it. I think what we said was, this made sense when all we were thinking about were trials where someone was going to be injected with a chemical, with a potential medicine. We had to explain to them what that medicine was for. Now, as we move to biobank research, we said maybe it's okay, and a similar goal, to tell people how their data will be used and what kind of products it'll be used in, what the risks will be to them, which will be largely independent of the kind of use that their data will be used for. New questions arise. You can ask questions about whether the subjects therefore need to know that someday it might be used for cloning or something. But we thought about it, we had a discussion about it, and we decided to go forward with biobanks, and I think to the advance of science, and actually it was the right choice. And so here too, I would say that our conversation about the idea of a challenge trial is not about whether we need to change our principles. It is applying principles in a new situation. But we've always thought about minimizing risk to subjects as being a cornerstone of our research, but now we're thinking about that in a new way. It's not that we're dropping it. Some could call that sophistry. I actually am very aware of that kind of criticism. I'd make it to myself. I'm paid by a med school. I'm always finding ways to do research. And that would be sophistry if it was really just finding a loophole. It is not. It was not for biobanks. It wasn't, again, just take another example, from the Helsinki Declaration, where the idea of pediatric research was questionable. How could you do research if the cornerstone is informed consent? You can never research anything on a child. Well, we decided there were ways to safely and ethically do research on children, of certain sorts, classified in various ways. I think you're familiar with that, Jonathan, and I can refer people to reading if they'd like. But it wasn't a matter of just giving up our goals of informed consent. It was a way of understanding that pediatric research was essential to providing good care to children, and it would not be ethically acceptable to never do research on children the way that some thought our ethical principles required. So thank you for the question, Jonathan. Again, I think it's a really interesting point about clarifying the role of bioethics in research in other areas where we engage in this conversation with our principles. We try to apply it to the current day and move forward and allow important and ethical research.
Excellent. Let me point out that Ezekiel Garfinkel is still with us, but not through video. So if anyone wants to address a question to him, do know that he's still here.
Yeah, I'm still here, sorry.
Good, no, not a problem at all. Andrew Brightman has a contribution and a question to make. Please come off mute and join us, Andrew. If he's still there. Okay, so how about Gregory Zimmett about demonstration of vaccine safety? Would you like to pose your question directly using your microphone?
Yes, sure. Hi, Peter.
Thank you.
So I'm less sanguine about the idea of challenge trials for vaccines, particularly a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. But one of the big questions I have, so one of the advantages of the challenge study is that you can make progress more quickly. But in so doing, how are you going to demonstrate safety? It's hard enough to demonstrate short-term safety with large phase 3 clinical trials. I don't see how you're going to get an adequate safety signal with a small challenge study, particularly longer-term potential safety. And then my concern is that if you approve a vaccine based on challenge studies, and it turns out there's a relatively rare safety problem with the vaccine that can't be detected in a challenge study, or a delayed safety problem, the damage that's going to do to immunization in general is mind-boggling. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has any thoughts about this, but that's been sort of a core concern when I think about challenge studies.
I could maybe make a couple of comments. I think that it's important, your comments are very apt, and those factors, those long-term fallouts will need to be considered as well as part of any kind of thorough analysis. One thing I would say though is safety is a social judgment. It's not an empirically addressable thing. Risk is empirically addressable. You can figure out the risk that an event occurs. Safety is a decision. And how safe is safe enough is a subjective judgment about, the whole context. So you could demonstrate some degree of, you could estimate some degree of risk. And if you felt it was low enough, or you could bound it so that you were reasonably confident it was low enough, that might be low enough to proceed.
But not with vaccines.
More studies going on, but you are right that in a short period of time, you're not going to be able to look at long-term risk. And in a small number of subjects, you're not going to be able to effectively rule out rare risks. I think Dr. Kaplan probably also wants.
Yeah, let me just, can you still hear me? Okay.
Mhm.
So I think your point does not apply to vaccines. I think you're wrong, actually. Safety, it's not just risk, it's safety. And in the world of vaccines, which is the world that I study, you can't do mass vaccination unless you can demonstrate. So it's not just like saying like, well, this is a vaccine that's going to be, that there's some 2% risk of something bad happening, so you get to decide whether you take it or not. The safety, the demonstration of safety that's demanded for vaccines is enormous because you're vaccinating healthy people. So anyway, I'm not so sure it's just sort of a risk kind of issue, particularly given the issues around vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy that have become really problematic for all vaccines.
I actually think you were agreeing with me. I think you were saying that safety is a social judgment, and you and others have made a social judgment that the degree of risk tolerated in many vaccine situations is extremely low and should be extremely low. And that's a social judgment and not necessarily an unreasonable one.
Okay.
Yeah, I can jump in with a couple comments. The first is, even in the big clinical trials, we are exposing people to significant risk, as you know better than most on this call. We're also using vaccine designs that have never produced a vaccine before, mRNA vaccines that may proliferate for who knows how long. To justify even recruiting somebody into a standard large clinical trial is going to require some acceptance of risk and maybe some failure to observe safety, because even in the big trials, historically recruitment has been in that 20 to 55-year-old group. Diversity not always there, hard to recruit minorities, don't see any pregnant women, doubt we're going to see any kids pushed forward by their parents to go in there. So there are limits to the big studies as well as to the little ones. Yes. Second, I think you're right. We should have a registry and be following everybody. I don't want accusations that we've seen historically of Guillain-Barré syndrome or other complications coming around. I don't see plans being made adequately to follow some subsegment either of the challenge group if it were to happen, but even of the large scale group if it were to happen. And then a third comment. You might get diversity in challenge studies, but you kind of have to do what we do in phase ones where there's no benefit, and that is do gradual enrollment, increasing who it is that gets exposed, starting with the healthiest folks, quote unquote, and then starting to expand out in phase 1 and 2 to a little more diverse and perhaps some more comorbidity exposures. So, even if you're starting out with a challenge study, the first 100 people, just to get a safety quick profile might be 20 to 30, then maybe you're going to go to 20 to 40. For the next 100, you can do stepwise recruitments in both large scale and small scale. The challenge is the recruitment. It isn't really just the science. Right. Historically, it's just been tough for drugs and vaccines to get us the kind of diversity that would really allow us to, if you will, minimize risk and try to say something about long-term safety, which lets me add one last thing. There is a difference between saying we can't do this because we don't have a rescue therapy, and we shouldn't do this unless we minimize risk. We do tons of things without rescue therapies. If that was the principle, there wouldn't be any phase 1 studies for most of everything. Devices would be collapsing. You couldn't recruit anybody to much of anything. Part of the reason we're doing them is you don't know what the hell the therapy is. So we're trying to make progress that way. So I don't find the argument about having a rescue therapy available persuasive to launching research. I do find the one about minimize risk and then slowly increase it. I think that still is a duty that we owe to subjects.
Right, and part of my point wasn't just about enrollees in challenge trials, but about using challenge trials to approve a vaccine that's then widely distributed.
No, understood.
And I agree with you that I cannot see a way that there's going to be a vaccine available even in early 2021, if ever. There, as you know, there are plenty of large phase 3 clinical trials that have failed after hopeful phase 1 and phase 2 trials. I think of, HSV2, several HSV2 vaccine trials that were abject failures in phase 3. So.
And in the drug space, just so everybody gets to go away depressed, from phase 1 safety to approval by the FDA, forget about manufacturing, it's about an 80% failure rate.
Thanks, Art. Gregory, much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks.
Someone named Jean Kraft, would you like to pose your question directly?
Sure. So one of the concerns that I have, and it actually was, one of you guys actually mentioned it, that the fact that dexamethasone may be helpful. So the way you know that is because there was a press release. Data has not been provided, hasn't been peer reviewed, hasn't been published. So it's basically scientific sharing via popular press and popular sentiment. And my concern is the amount of marketing that is entering scientific discovery. Now, there's always been some marketing because somebody gains benefit from the information, but my concern is that as things are moving along quickly, the popular press, the public are increasingly weighing in on things that are may be true, and that would be fantastic, but may not be true, and in fact may be harmful. And I'm just wondering if we're entering a new normal where scientific rigor is degrading. I mean, it's concerning to me.
Jeannie, thank you. Izzy, is that the question you'd like to take on by chance? Izzy, are you with us?
He's out posting a preprint right now.
He is.
Hi, sorry, dropped out. I'm suffering from bad signal.
Did you hear Jeannie's question?
No, sorry.
Okay.
No.
Anyone
Maybe
else?
I could maybe venture something.
Please.
I think it's a very apt question. A lot of the work that I'm involved in is so-called RRT, rigor, reproducibility, transparency, and so I think about the fidelity of communications a lot, and I'm kind of two minds of it. One as a member of an organized scientific community, and then another as just a broader member of society. And as a broader member of society, we have this First Amendment, and I think most of us hold that very dear, and that allows us to speak, and it allows us to speak quite freely, and I think that's a good thing. And it would be difficult for us to shut people down and say you can only speak after it's peer reviewed, and you can only speak, in the ways that the peer reviewers say you may speak. And I think that would be troubling and illegal. On the other hand, I think that we often give up certain rights that we have as broad members of the community when we join more narrow communities and say, as long as you're part of this community, you have to behave with these norms. And I think many of us who are at universities, for example, we've joined the university community. And I think it would not be unreasonable for us as part of those communities to say there are some norms that say you don't communicate in certain ways. And we do that sometimes. And I think we should do a lot of things to increase the fidelity of communications coming out of academia, which are not great. Whether preprints are particularly problematic, I'm less sure, but I do think we want to take steps to really just improve the fidelity of communications and reduce exaggerations in general.
Thank you, Jean and David. Stephanie, were you raising your hand to comment on that particular, please?
Yes, I know I'm not the only one, but as a past editor, former editor of a journal, I speak to the value of having peer review. It's not perfect, it's not a panacea, but I think that I'm very concerned that the rush to get out there first tends to be a rush to get out there and maybe be accurate and reliable, and that's really problematic to the whole scientific community in the long run when you have to undo things that were sloppily done. I think that hurried science is often sloppy science, and that's not really good science worth having. So I think we really need to be very careful about about preprints and their role that they're playing in the discussion.
Yeah. Art?
I wanted to jump in here. I think just a couple of quick points. First, I do worry about presentations at meetings or claims made without data or paper being available. That's not necessarily peer review, but at least, you know, you want to see something that you could look at. I'm going all the way back here to the claims out of China about germline engineering embryos done at a press conference. Nobody had a paper, nobody had any data. I subsequently had a chance to be one of the peer reviewers of the paper that the author put together. It was horrible. Even I knew it was horrible, given my amateur science levels. So let's see data, let's see a paper, let's see something, not just a sworn testimony or a testimonial. That's not science. Second, I'm with Stephanie, I'm all for peer review, but I do think it's really getting strained in the pandemic. I don't know about people listening. I'm getting literally 3 or 4 requests a day to peer review. Peer reviewers are overwhelmed. Editors are running out of people who know something about vaccines. I mean, if they're getting to me, trust me, they're running out of people to know things that should be doing the peer review. So we need to do something to bolster that. And that leads me to my last comment. Even when it's peer reviewed, you know, we've seen a lot of retractions, a lot of problems with the peer reviewed literature. I don't know if it's better or worse. I can't comment. Stephanie knows more about the history here than I do. But what I will say is, I do think the premier journals ought to be hiring more statisticians, more random checks on the papers that are submitted. You're not going to do them all, but you could audit a little bit more to see how's the methods, does it square up with the conclusions, what's the statistics look like. Clearly peer reviewers aren't going to invest the kind of time to do that. I'm just saying maybe they should, but they don't. And so I think the model needs to be re-examined. It's a good topic, Roz, for another webinar someday.
And in fact, I think we could continue to talk about this, but I'm noting Andrew Brightman is actually still with us, never left, but his mic was not working. So he's asked me to read his question. And that is, several panelists have highlighted the importance of data, empirical evidence, and numeracy to understanding risk and thus ethical action. However, it seems that many people, the public in general, as well as policymakers, seem to poorly understand both numbers and risk. So how could research findings best be communicated to public and to policymakers to have the most ethical responses to testing, treatments, and vaccines?
Well, I'm glad Andrew asked the easy question, which we'll have a quick, easy answer for right now.
In our last few minutes, yeah.
I've got to say, Andrew, I'm not surprised knowing you that you'd kill us with this. But look, you know, I think you know me, and you know that we aren't going to make everybody a scientist. But it's true from what Art said from the very beginning, which is the communication is essential, and help people understand that responsible way what the evidence is, in the way that I think some of our leaders say countrywide have done very well. Dr. Fauci is, I think, a model for a person communicating exactly what you're asking for, Andrew. And it's a skill, it's a learned skill as well as something people have some abilities, maybe difference just how they're born and their ability to communicate. It's something we have to teach our students, teach our postdocs, and to try to achieve ourselves. It's not going to be about making everybody numerate and everybody experts with probability, but it's to be able to convey a clear message and then provide the backup for it. One thing Greg Zimmet mentioned earlier I thought was very important about vaccines. And anything we do with vaccines, any new creative trials, have to be understood to be occurring in a cauldron, in a glass house, right? That anything you do, if anything goes wrong, the stones will fly in a way in which certain areas experience and other areas, maybe which some of us like doing research in, where there's less of this crosstalk and anger, where other areas are easier. But I think that's right, Andrew. Think about it from the very beginning. If we went down this road, and we will need to go down this road with a formulation of a vaccine in this area, being very aware that all eyes are on us. Transparency is essential. Overwhelming people with data is not the answer, but making data available and explained when necessary is an essential part of how we move forward. Again, I know I would give you an easy and quick answer to your question there, Andrew, so I came through.
Which is appropriate in our last 4 minutes, so thank you, Peter. There's someone named Stanley Spinola, if you're still there, wants to just make a few comments. Stanley, if you can make one comment and do it in about a minute, that would be helpful.
Yeah, hi everybody. I've been doing controlled human challenge experiments since 1992 and with a bacterial skin pathogen. And Dr. Allison brought up some issues concerning practicality. In 2006, when I was required to get an IND, I worked on that doing nothing else. It took me 9 months. There were other human challenge trials that had to go under IND at that time. It took them as long as 3 years. There's the issue of strain selection. There's already 100 genotypes. You would have to have some preclinical data to get to an IND. And then once you got an IND, it would probably take infection from the influenza models. It takes infection of approximately 50 subjects over a period of 15 to 18 months to even standardize the model. And in this type of model, you would have to go very slowly because of toxicity concerns. I guess the other thing that I would find it very difficult to do is to write an informed consent statement for a model like this. We can talk about chances of someone having disease that would lead to their hospitalization. In the age groups that we're talking about, those chances range between 5 to 10%, in which case their average length of stay will be 2 weeks. We know nothing about the long-term outcome for someone who's so severely infected. Certainly you've all heard the anecdotes of people who have chronic respiratory or renal insufficiency after they've quote unquote recovered from COVID-19. So from many perspectives, I'm not very enthusiastic about this speeding vaccines. As Dr. Zimmet pointed out, this doesn't obviate having to do the large phase 3 trials. The only thing it might do is it might exclude some vaccine candidates from not working. And then other issues we haven't even discussed are what are the risks to the healthcare workers who have to take care of these people in the challenge units? What happens if someone gets disabled or they get hospitalized? Challenge study going to pay for that? So I think there's multiple issues here that we simply don't have enough information about that lead me to think that this is not, in the short term, a practical solution.
Stanley, you have closed our session in a deeply provocative way. And I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to actually respond to some of the points you've made, but thank you for making them. And in our last minute, it's really not fair because I'm the moderator, but I have to say, David, at some point, we're gonna have to talk about this pay for volunteerism, or what in normal circumstances we would see as volunteerism. I thought we got rid of that with things like realizing surrogate motherhood ended up in India. But we can talk about it some other time. My concern being that very wealthy people could likely opt out. But look what I've done. I've made another provocative comment with no capacity for you to respond to it. At least we know each other and we can follow up. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone. It's been quite a rich conversation, and it couldn't have happened without every one of you. Izzy, we don't see you, but we know you're there. Thank you for the effort to be with us in the evening from Israel.
Yeah, apologies for the sound.
Well, we've got to get our engineers to work on that. This has been a wonderful panel. It's a very serious time to be having this conversation. Thanks for the encouragement, Art, about the bright future ahead. We'll get there somehow. We always seem to manage somehow. It may take us a while. We are having another panel on Friday. This one is also about COVID, but we'll be looking at issues of injustice and disparity. Another rather bleak but difficult but important conversation. I am so grateful. I am so grateful. Thank you all.